The sermon title today is Power, Temptation, and Valentines. And I'm going to focus today on temptation because that's what the scripture is. And usually when we talk about temptation in the church, usually it's always applied to the body, the carnality of temptation. So I'm going to look at the scripture of the story of Jesus' temptation and see if there's anything that we can pull out of that that's going to be body positive. And we're going to reframe temptation in just that way. But first, I want to read you a lovely, juicy poem from one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, entitled West Wind, number 6. Mary Oliver just happens to be Episcopalian, by the way. When the sun goes down, the roses fling off their red dresses and put on their black dresses. The wind is coming over the sandy streets of the town called Moonlight, with his long arms, with his silver mouth, his hands humorous at first, then serious, then crazy, touching their faces, their dark petals, until they begin rising and falling, the honeyed seizures. All day they have been busy being roses, gazing responsible over the sand, into the sky, into the blue ocean. So why not a little comfort, a little rippling pleasure? You there, puddled in lamplight at your midnight desk, you there rewriting nature so anyone can understand it, what will you say about the roses? Their sighing, their tossing, and the want of the heart, and the trill of the heart, and the burning mouth of the wind. On this day, as we consider temptations of the flesh, let us remember the sensuality of the roses in their black dresses. And now another story about a different flower. I love hibiscus plants. I always thought they were too exotic for me to grow, however, but they have these huge 4 or 5-inch blossoms. I saw plenty of them in Florida. 2 years ago, I decided to take the plunge and I bought one myself. And sure enough, as long as I watered it and fertilized it, it just had these huge yellow blossoms. I enjoyed it so much, and then life got busy and I forgot to fertilize it. It stopped blooming. It didn't die, it just stopped blooming. So I fertilized it some more, and then it was fine. So, put it in the porch, sub-zero weather, a couple of days in a row last winter. And when I went out there to feel the twigs, they broke off in my hands. That plant was dead. Now, this year, I got another one. And it did really well until I forgot to fertilize it, and it was just green. Okay, so fertilize it some more. But now it's sitting next to my house where I hope it's warmer. Now, I went out there and I pushed, there's no leaves, it's just little straggly things like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And I moved the twigs and they didn't break. So I know it's still alive. It's still alive. The life force is still in my plant. As we consider the temptations of the flesh, let us remember the life force in the hibiscus that needs to be fed. And even when there's no greenery or blooms, it is still there. Now, most of you know I was a campus minister at the University of Pennsylvania for 21 years, and I discovered there are 2 kinds of Christians in the student body there. And they're very different in how they approach the body. One group came from the evangelical churches. They're very earnest Christians. They prayed a lot. They read their Bible a lot. And they also sometimes witnessed a lot, whether their peers wanted to hear that witnessing or not. For them, the body, they also avoided frat parties or, all kinds of wickedness like that. They think that the body and the body's physical needs and sensual pleasures are suspect, probably sinful, and need to be monitored and repressed at all cost. God and the flesh are on opposite extremes. One is pure and holy, that's God, and the other is base and shameful, unless it's sanctified through marriage. Okay. The second group of Christian students are those who come from mainline churches or perhaps progressive churches such as ours. There's a less of a need for them to obey rules and more of an emphasis on living righteous lives. They tend to be more moderate about parties, less showy about their religious beliefs, and in order to fit in, usually never told anybody they were Christians, lest they get lumped into that other category. They accept the body's needs and desires, and they don't necessarily think they're sinful, but they aren't sure why or why not. They're more likely to say, well, God made us this way, so it can't be bad. So while this group of Christian students are not terribly repressed, they live in a spiritual vacuum, for they've never heard of a body-positive Christianity. And seldom has their congregation talked with them about the ethics of making intimacy decisions. God and the flesh, for this group, never quite fit together. Almost without fail, every fall, an evangelical student who would usually never darken the doorway to me as a woman minister, they would come into my office. And after a few minutes, it would come out. I have a problem. I can't stop thinking about girls, if it's a guy. Sometimes it's girls talking about guys, but usually it's not. Okay? I keep lusting. Now, and they say, oh, I prayed so hard, morning, noon, and night. I read my Bible all the time, and I can't stop lusting. They sometimes were near tears, and my heart just went out to them because they're trapped in a body-phobic Christianity, and they can't get out. He is earnestly trying to be good and righteous as the church has told him to be, and yet his body and his mind are not conforming. And he's in deep anguish because somebody has told him that feelings are sinful. And there's a Bible verse that they use for that, and we're going to come back to that at the end. Now, Valentine's Day. There are ministers today who, upon hearing the text is the temptation of Jesus, will make it a point, use this as an opportunity to preach about the temptations of carnal flesh. The words fornication, adultery, and abomination will be thrown around to keep the flock, that's you, pure and untainted. You will not hear that from me today. Let's turn to the story of Jesus' temptations and see if we can apply any of this to our intimate lives and our basic human needs. As our story begins, Jesus is full of the Spirit after his baptism, and he enters the wilderness. Now, when you're full of the Spirit, it means you are tuned to God, to the highest spiritual self. As the beginning of his ministry, he's listening for direction of what God has got in mind for him and what he should be doing. Now, I have a plaque of a picture of a sculpture of a big hand and a little child leaning into that hand. So the child is about as big as the hand, but not quite. And the hand is curving over this child. That child's posture is what it is to be full of the Spirit. The child is totally leaning in, knowing that this hand is strong and going to protect the child. There's a lot of trust in that sculpture. When we lean into the power of the Spirit, then we can open our eyes and see what direction we are to go. And that's where Jesus was when he went into the desert, in that posture. However, after a lot of physical needs such as hunger and being alone all of this time and probably forgotten, the ego begins to reassert itself. Better take care of yourself. You're hungry, you know. Nobody else is going to take care of you. You're all alone. Don't trust other people. It's all about you. And then the posture, when we hear that, begins to shift. And we move away from that leaning in to stand up on our own to take care of ourselves. Now, in psychological language, it's the ego. In biblical language, it's Satan. But it's one and the same thing, because the bottom line is they both tell you to stand up and do it yourself. You don't need anybody else, and certainly not God. And when we do that, we can slip out of the hand of God, and we're tempted to do it on our own without divine intervention or divine assistance. So, before long, Jesus begins to hear the voice, telling him to act on his own power. Command this stone to become a loaf of bread, the voice says. You can do it. You're important like that. And then all the kingdoms of the world and their glory are yours if you just change your allegiance or change your posture, to use my metaphor. And forget who you are, or forget whose you are. The voice wants to shift our priority from God to ourselves, and then people will follow you and think you're grand. Throw yourself from a pinnacle and God will catch you, the voice continues. Now, a hungry person would like to have stones turned into bread. And the fantasies of having lots of worldly power and people adoring you sounds pretty good, right? Think about it. Power over gravity, power over bodily needs, power over nations and wealth and glory, if you stop leaning into God. Yet in this almost delusional state, Jesus keeps his wits. And he meets each power-filled fantasy and ego thought with the question, now, what is my life about? And each time he says, my priority is to let God be in charge of my life. I will not usurp God's power even though I am hungry. I will not play God or play mind games and try God's patience. I will let God be God, even in his great need, he said. I will let God be God. So this is not a story about temptation of the sins of the flesh, no matter how many preachers today want to make it that way. And it is not about making stones into bread or jumping off pinnacles to see if God has a parachute or cutting deals so everybody will adore him. Rather, this story is about the ego's desire to have power, including physical needs. Power over physical needs. TV preachers, beware now. Because those who taunt people to control, repress, restrict the beautiful bodily feelings of the sensuality of life are doing exactly what Satan was doing to Jesus. It is an attempt to cut off that which nurtures and keeps us protected and appreciating life. If we are cut off, we will begin to splinter like my hibiscus twig. Okay? To stand up and place ourselves as number one is what Satan wanted Jesus to do. To deny our bodily desires and delights is what anti-body preachers insist we must do. Both are suggesting we cut ourselves off from our spiritual life force, which we know, at least in part, through our body's senses. And that includes sensuality and sexuality. When we lean into God and love our bodies and those of others, when we appreciate sensual beauty and intimacy, it is like the water that for that thirsty plant and the fertilizer for the roots that will make it bloom. The gift is to be alive in these bodies. Now, we all don't have to produce blooms, okay, to be fully alive. We do not all have to engage in a physical relationship with someone else to appreciate the roses who put on their black dresses at night and sway in a dance with the wind. Back at the university, I would ask each confessional student if they had an insatiable desire that they would do nearly anything to get that person in bed, like King David did to Bathsheba. Are they at the point of rape or premeditated murder? Now, at this point, the evangelical Christian is going just, oh, no, nothing like that. Right? Okay. I ask, are you studying? Are you able to function? Is it interfering with your abilities? Well, no, not at all. They're simply overwhelmed with the guilt and shame that somebody planted in their heads. When we teach messages that say our body's needs and desires are dangerous, we withdraw the source of life just as surely as when I stop fertilizing my plants. Somebody has never watered these young adults with messages that it's good to be alive in these bodies with all of our physical desires and sensual needs, that these are to be celebrated, the desire to be held and caressed, loved, nurtured, the desire for pleasure, for intimacy, for companionship, the beauty of a sensual world. It's a part and parcel of what it is to have a human experience, and it is all a sacred gift. So, I tell the students that they're not experiencing lust. Lust in the Bible is always about coveting. It is never a rush of hormones. Let me repeat that. Lust in the Bible is always about coveting. It is never about the rush of hormones. Instead, what they are experiencing is the joy and delight of being human. And God does not condemn what our biology longs for. I'm going to have to repeat that too. God does not condemn what our biology longs for. I'm going to switch metaphors here. Maybe we should think of temptation like this. Temptation is the aroma, not the brownie. For we have permission to actually taste the brownie, as long as it's well considered. The ego/devil offers only the aroma. But God delivers. The sensuality of the brownie is ours. Not just the aroma. I'm being radical here. I don't know if anybody's catching that. Okay? God does not offer something that we cannot enjoy. And God always offers good things for us. Pleasurable things, in fact. The needs of the spirit and the needs of the body are not like right and wrong, or wrong and right. They are of a piece. I tell these young people, rejoice and be glad, for those feelings tell you you are alive and everything is working as it should be. God does not condemn your feelings. We must simply exercise responsible judgment about whether or not and when to engage in those behaviors. Now, not everyone has those kinds of sexual feelings or wants them, and that's okay. But the sensual needs cannot be denied. That is part of what it is to be human. Now, before I close, I want to return to the passage of Scripture that is used to argue that feelings are sins. Matthew 5:28. Jesus says, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. What they are missing when they use that passage to condemn feelings is what precedes it and parallels it. This is what it says. Jesus says, you have heard that the ancients were told you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with a brother shall be guilty before the court, as if they had committed murder. Got that? As if they'd committed murder. Now, no one is running around and saying, oh, you have committed murder because you were angry. But they do go around and say, you have committed adultery because you have lusted. So, not only is that logically inconsistent, it is totally out of character with chapter 5, which is the Sermon on the Mount. All of those teachings in that chapter are about how to live a righteous life, what a righteous life looks like. And Jesus says to his followers who are marginalized and hungry and illiterate fishermen and disenfranchised with no power and oppressed people, and he says, you know, you are the light of the world and you're the salt of the earth. when you're mourning, when you are gentle, if you hunger and thirst after righteousness, if you're merciful and pure in heart, or are peacemakers, or have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, this is when you are righteous and show you are followers of mine. Now, obviously, none of that teaching has anything to do with the sensuality or the so-called carnality of the flesh that people want to insert into that following passage, that they twist that verse into. Jesus is not teaching against feelings of lust or covetousness, nor anger. He is teaching instead that behaviors originate from our feelings. So be aware of the state of your heart. In other words, be aware of the posture that you are in. Are we leaning into God's hands? Are we trusting in the goodness of God as our life priority? For if so, it will show by the behaviors that we choose and the decisions that we make. Satan didn't know his audience. Jesus knew his priorities. Full of the Spirit he was, and he was leaning into God, trusting in God's sufficiency. That is the right and righteous posture for each one of us. That is our posture. Lean, trust, and most of all, celebrate the sensuality that is the gift of life. Love is the best we can hope for. The sensuality of life was a gift of love by the lover of the universe. It's all about love. Lean, trust, and celebrate. Happy Valentine's Day.